Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to watch this video. This is a pre-recorded video that we're doing with some questions that you guys submitted. And I really appreciate you guys participating in just sharing the knowledge and getting it more evenly and widely distributed out there in a way that we really feel is going to be a lot more accessible than like your standard live stream or comments thread on social media. Um, we really appreciate everybody who submitted questions. We did get a lot of questions submitted, so we're not going to be able to address every single thing that came up, but we will do our best to give really comprehensive answers to everything that came in to the best of our ability. We did get a lot of questions about fermentation and about food safety in general, specifically questions pertaining to why we would choose to use fermentation as a primary food safety method as opposed to other sort of intervention methods like HPP or bacteriophages and things like that. So if you guys kind of want to speak a little bit to kind of what led us to fermentation a little bit and why we would choose to do that over other, maybe perhaps harsher intervention methods. I think that'll be
Great question.
that's our first.
Yes, great question.
Yeah.
I guess I'll get started and Chelsea jump in, and I'm sure I'm going to forget a lot of things, but uh, the basics. When you're looking, so when I was commissioned to look into developing raw food diets, it's obviously the word raw can be a little bit controversial on what that constitutes, but in my opinion, it's obviously a very minimally processed food, and you want to intervene as minimally as possible to keep the food in its natural state. But also, as a manufacturer, you need to be able to deliver that food in a safe and as much as you can keep it in the original state, but safely to your consumer. There are a lot of intervention methods out there that are claimed to be less invasive, a little bit more minimal. But when I looked at the choices and everything that's presented to me, my background is in food fermentation. So obviously, cheese making, fermented foods came very naturally to me. And I'm very comfortable with them having that background. And so when I was looking at uh, food in general and keeping food raw, it made a lot of sense to me to use a term, what they call competitive inhibition. And it's basically fermentation or using Mother Nature's microbial load to balance that so that you have more beneficial bacteria than you do pathogens. And that to me, when you're looking to feed these carnivores the most species appropriate diet that you can, uh, delivering the most nutrient dense form of the food, that as opposed to a mechanical intervention where you're either applying heat to kill bacteria or pressure to kill bacteria, it just made more sense to me as a scientist to that was more appropriate with the food itself. So there's a lot of controversy out there on what intervention methods are the best and what is minimally processed, and I think that should be left up to the consumer. It always comes down to benefit versus risk, right? When you're looking at how do you safely manufacture a food and how do you offer that food in the highest quality state that you can uh, for the end user that you're making it for. And speaking of AFCO, Chelsea, uh, we were just there at the AFCO meeting in San Antonio, and there was a presentation delivered by, her name is Mary Grace Denayo. She's a PhD, and she is in the Food Science and Technology Department of Nebraska, University of Nebraska, and they do a lot of research on HPP. And we're always trying to learn and get new information and stay up on the different methodologies that are out there. And I thought she delivered a really great presentation, and it solidified in my mind what some of the negatives to using that intervention. So there's always positives and negatives to every type of intervention you're using. And one of the things that concerns me with some of the pressure technologies and using it for raw pet food is the that it's not a foolproof intervention, and nothing is a foolproof intervention. And that's one thing that I have learned of being in the food business well over 25 years, is that there is nothing that's foolproof on any kind of intervention. So when you're looking at food safety, there's absolutely no 100% guarantees. You do things to mitigate your risk. So just like you, there's a risk to everything you do. Driving cars, for instance, statistically, if you just look at statistics and you say, okay, what's the dangers of driving a car? And most everyone would probably say the convenience of having a car and driving somewhere outweighs any risk that I might have getting into a car crash. But you get in the car and you put your seatbelt on and you take precautions, right? And it's the same with any type of system of delivery to the end user on food. There's only so much intervention you can do. Nothing's 100%. But food safety is not just a single intervention method. And that's what I kind of wanted to talk to a little bit today on those questions, because it's a series of steps and a series of basic philosophy that you follow to get the safest food. And so it's not, well, you just cook it and then it's good, or you just do this to it and then it's good. It's, healthy food is a series of steps to get you to the highest quality. And that's part of the process in delivering the most nutritious and safe food. And so when I look at those intervention steps and the processes you take as a manufacturer, that's where you want to negate the harshest steps, right? And you want to keep it to minimal intervention so that you get the freshest food that you possibly can. And whether you want to call it raw or not raw, at that point, I think that's subjective in people's minds. Most people would define raw as not heated. I think that pressure has very similar capabilities of damage that heat does on food. So I think moving forward, as these new technologies are introduced, that's going to be a subject of controversy. But for us as a manufacturer, fermentation is validated as far as the intervention of it to be conducive to pathogen reduction. There's a very long history of it used in the food industry, and it continues to gain support. So when I look at delivering a raw diet to a dog, to me, that's the most conducive way to, it's the most copacetic to say, wow, this is something where we can really deliver a raw product with very minimal introduction of anything harsh, no chemicals, no preservatives, and actually enhance the digestibility of the food. So it's really a win-win on that situation. And there's very few dogs that I've come across in this in the industry that have any negative effects to fermentation. So I'll leave it at that, and Chelsea.
So I want to elaborate a little bit on a point that you were getting at. So I just want to clarify that when you're doing other stopgap methods like cooking or high pressure pasteurization or irradiation, then largely once that's done, then the intervention method is finished, and after that there's no longer protection over that food. You killed any pathogens that have already been exposed in the food, And in some cases, you hopefully have killed them. In HPP, all of the current literature is very clear that if you are not super meticulous in the way that the product is handled after the HPP process, which in theory could also occur with cooking and irradiation, then those pathogens are only sublethally injured. So they can actually recover after the intervention step. And also, it's not protecting the product from future contamination, like during delivery or repackaging, because the product is not typically HPP'd in the same package that it ends in. So as soon as they open it, probably reform it into patties or sliders and then put it into another package that has potentially recontaminated it. When you get it into your home, like, you've also largely eliminated other bacteria, so you don't have what Roxanne was talking about of competitive inhibition anymore to continue to protect the product. So that's largely why we really like fermentation, is because the protective mechanism for eliminating the pathogens, it starts at the fermentation and it doesn't end until it's consumed. So you have a longer period of protection with that product. A couple of other points that are really relevant. One, with cooking, we don't love that there are some negative byproducts that are produced in the process of cooking. So acrylamides and heterocyclic amines are things that we know to be carcinogenic that occur when you heat proteins and carbohydrates. And then with HPP, there's a couple of very specific things, like, we could go all day on the science behind that. But one thing that's really important is HPP is ineffective against high fat products. We have a ketogenic product, so it doesn't actually take very high fat. So most research says anything over 10% is considered too high fat for HPP to be effective. The reason for that is because the fat actually acts as a protective mechanism for the pathogen. The pathogens can hide within the fat and not be injured by the pressure. Also, low moisture. So 60 to 80% is necessary for it to be effective. Our product, it averages around 68%, but especially being higher fat, we're teetering on the lower end of moisture, so wouldn't be effective anyways. But also of note, if you have a product that's like freeze dried or dehydrated or something that's a really low moisture product, then it wouldn't have been effective to do high pressure pasteurization on that at the time that it was dried, which means that there was a requirement for it to be done while it was raw, reopen the package, spend time drying it, then repackaging it, getting it to your home. Like, there's so many steps in there that really eliminate most of the benefit of having done that step to begin with, that the value isn't worth it. The last thing is, like, I would say mostly with HPP, this is also true with some of the cooked products. If they're cooked in plastic, we're not big fans of plastic. If you have a product that's going through high pressure pasteurization, it is absolutely mandatory that that plastic has at least 15% flex. So in order to create a soft plastic that's pliable, you have to add in a whole bunch of chemicals. So phthalates or plasticizers have to be put in there. They're really unstable. So like when you get in a new car and you have that new car smell, that's the smell of those releasing. That's very unhealthy for you to be breathing. There's a lot of science behind the disruption on the endocrine system there. And there is scientific evidence that there is what they call a significant migration of plasticizers into the food matrix with high pressures. So we don't even use plastic on our food at all in storage, much less do we want to put plastic around our food and then either cook it or pressurize it in a way that's going to release some of those loose plasticizers into the food matrix and have them consumed on a regular basis by your pet.
Fantastic. Yeah, even in I'll just add to that. So even if they're, I know that the evidence and the technologies or the documentation is spotty out there on the transfer of plastics into the food, but at least in the in the publications that I've read, they say that it doesn't add. They say that there isn't evidence to support that it's adding more plastic. So even if we step back and we go with that, and they say, okay, we can't show the evidence that more plastic is being driven into the food from HPP, but that alone, even just the fact that you have to do this technology in a plastic wrap, and as Chelsea said, we learned at the from the PhD that gave the presentation at AFCO that who has this a lot of knowledge on this technology, you have to use 15% flex. And so we know that the more plasticizer required is how it gets your plastic container becomes flexible. So obviously softer plastic, more plasticizer in it, harder plastic. So if you have at least that 15% touching the food, there is evidence to support that either freezing or heating in that will certainly, like Chelsea said, those plasticizers are very unstable. They have an affinity for fat. They want it. And the other thing that we don't know a lot about yet that they're still trying to do research on is these plasticizers, these phthalates, are accumulative in the body. They don't really break down well, and we don't have the ability to detox these really well in our system. So if you're feeding an animal a diet that is in plastic and possibly HPP'd on a daily basis every single day, what is that accumulation effect going to be? And then lastly, I'll just conclude with this. If from a menu, if you're asking me, why we're choosing not to use this technology and to use something alternative, as a manufacturer, I feel responsible. We're responsible for what we put out into the environment, right, in packaging. And so I know for Chelsea and for me, it's very important that we don't add to that plastic pollution. So right now, the only product that's in any plastic is our cheese, and that we're still looking at possible alternatives for that. But everything else is either in a cellulose or fibrous casing or in a wax paper coated. And that's really important to us. And we know that that's important to a lot of consumers. So if your technology for your intervention is dependent on your product being in plastic, that to me is a real deterrent as a manufacturer who's looking to try to get away from plastic packaging.
And to be clear, the level of high exposure for a phthalate is actually 1 part per million. So even if you're testing in the parts per billion, which seems extraordinarily low, you just get to 1 part per million, and you've already exceeded the amount that you should be exposed to.
Great. So to sum up, essentially, fermentation provides benefits that nobody else does, and the other intervention methods just simply aren't worth the risk and wouldn't necessarily work with our products anyway.
Correct.
Good summary.
Awesome. Fantastic answer. Our next question, there's several people who were asking questions about our new cat recipe, and specifically how the chicken for cats and pork for cats differ from the original recipe and now dog recipe that we had put out originally. And also, like, one thing people were kind of curious about is, instead of having the cat recipe, the modifications where you can add jiggles or milk to the dog recipe, doing that versus feeding the cat recipe and what the differences there would necessarily be. So if you guys want to talk about like the unique cat formula, and kind of touch on why that would be something we were interested in doing, as opposed to just continuing to use the alteration method for the dog recipe, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, fine tuning for cats. Basically, they're both obviously they're carnivores, both cats and dogs. Cats being considered obligate carnivores. They seem to have a little bit, I think, in their nature, require a little bit higher protein, higher moisture. They can do better on a little bit lower fat, but not necessarily eliminating fat, of course, from their diet. So it's really just, I think Chelsea just fine tuned it a little bit to do a little higher protein, a little more moisture. Obviously, we took the vegetables out. Really don't require the vegetables. So for that reason, that's going to be a little bit different. But the basic macronutrient profile doesn't look a whole lot different. And then as far as you talked about puppies and kittens, I think for feeding
No,
the
if you were to adjust the dog recipe to feed to cats, originally we were suggesting that people just add the jiggles and milk.
yes. Yes.
What the difference
So,
between doing that versus
yeah. So if you add the jiggles or milk at 10% of the calories, you're going to dilute the recipe a little bit so that the fat level goes down and the protein goes up a bit. The moisture is going to go up a bit. Of course, when you add gelatin, you're adding another whole load of amino acids in their pure form. So you're getting that protein up a little bit. And it's just kind of covering your bases. Milk and broth can be very good insurance policies from a nutrition standpoint, that you're covering your basics and making sure, obviously, meat in general and any kind of animal products give you 100% of your amino acids, right, or your essential amino acids. But then you can fine tune things to give more or less of certain amino acids or your branch chain amino acids or sulfur containing amino acids, depending on what you're putting in there. But using whole foods to get those, in my opinion, is still the superior way to get those macronutrients in the most digestible form. So the milk and the jiggles can be added to the dog food to sort of satisfy those nuances for a cat. That's kind of how I see it. Chelsea, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I don't really have much to add outside of just reminding people that even with the cat food, even though we have added in other things, like we have more milk in there, we've got some gelatin in there, it doesn't mean that you can't add more milk and more gelatin, because like Roxanne said, those have so many amazing nutrients and cats do so well on those things. So it's not like because we added them, you shouldn't be adding more. If you wanted to do that, that's absolutely fine. It's also fine if you just want to use the dog formula that's adjusted. So, like, I know a few people that have multi-dog and cat households, and they're like, it's just so much easier to buy a 20-pound box that you're giving to everybody. Just make sure that you're doing the modification, because like Roxanne said, cats need a little higher protein, a little lower fat. That's why we offered that modification. So that's fine if you want to do that. Most cat people prefer to have something that says it's for cats, and so that's why we did that, and adjusted the ingredients a little bit to make sure that it's very cat appropriate. Not just very cat appropriate, but like amazing.
Yeah, it is the best cat food recipe I've ever seen. And yeah, so it's just a specific cat thing with higher moisture, more protein, lower fat. But if people want to continue adjusting the dog recipe, they completely can. And they're still going to be feeding something that is absolutely beautiful.
100% appropriate for cats. Absolutely. Yes.
Speaking of adjustments and modifications, we got a lot of questions about the new tummy butter Kefir, and specifically what extra benefits it has now as opposed to the original recipe. And if there's any tips that you guys have for kind of transitioning a pet who might not be used to kefir onto like a more sour milk. So talking about the increased benefits of kefir and kind of why we chose to put that product out on the market. And then maybe helping a little bit with some transitionary issues over to the new formula.
Sure, I'll start with that. So when you're looking at the microbiome. And and again, this is an evolving science. We in no way, shape, or form have this down. There's a lot of great groups out there doing research on animal microbiomes, human microbiomes, and it's still in its infancy. But the key, I think, in these situations, when you're trying to reestablish a balanced gut, or you're just working with a young animal or a young dog, a puppy, and you want to make sure that they have a balanced gut going into adulthood. What I take away when I dive into the science is diversity is key. So the more you can diversify that microbial load that your dog or cat is exposed to, the better off you're going to be, for sure. And that takes the gamut, a huge plethora of different fermented foods, and that's the other thing that I think is really a benefit when you're looking at trying to re-inoculate the gut, reestablish good flora, is looking at offering your dog or cat products that have live microorganisms already metabolizing and active in there. I just think that is, in my personal opinion, my scientific opinion, that's a step above powders and pills. I think those can work. I'm not trying to get down on pills and powders, and there's a lot of good probiotics out there. When we make our cheese, of course, we start with a lyophilized or freeze-dried culture that goes into it, and that proliferates. But when you're feeding an animal, to me, starting with those organisms already metabolizing, already established in a nice balanced food system, that's just a step ahead than doing the pills or powder. So I just want to start with that. But the nuances between a cultured milk and kefir per se really is just a matter of the type of fermentation you're doing or the process you're doing. So a true kefir will use a starter culture called kefir grains. And for those of you who are not familiar with kefir grains, there's no grain in it, okay? So the word grain is used, and a lot of people are like, well, what grain is in there? It's not an actual grain, but it's the cultures develop a polysaccharide type coating similar to a kombucha mother. It's like a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, and they create these little polysaccharide kind of balls that look like rice or grains of rice almost, or grains of anything that you want to put together like that. And so that's why they're called kefir grains. And they're important because, again, we're looking at that diversity and how these, so nothing operates isolated, right? So this is where nutrients, bacteria, nothing works isolated by itself. It's always in a balanced ecosystem, whether that's a micro ecosystem or macro ecosystem. So when you create these really nice little micro ecosystems that love to work together, you can get some amazing effects by the postbiotics and byproducts that they make metabolizing together. So in the tummy butter kefir, there are kefir grains now. And what you do in that situation is you actually warm the milk. So to make a proper kefir, you have to warm the milk. You don't pasteurize it. You don't warm it to more than about 100 to 104 degrees would be about the highest you want to warm it. Our manufacturer, the one who produces our kefir, takes it to about 80 or 85 degrees. And then that's allowed, and that's the happy place, right, for these cultures. So when you're looking at microorganisms and where they want to proliferate, just like humans, 70 degrees is ideal. We want a pH of 7. We want the environment to be conducive for us to be happy and to grow. Well, that's what you're creating when you warm the milk. You're making an environment that, yay, this is a great temperature for us. We want to metabolize. We want to eat nutrients. And then you allow them to grow to the point where they produce enough acid that becomes sour to the tongue, right? And so you're talking, Eric, how now this tastes different to my dog. So cultured milk, right? The cultured goat goes in, The milk is not heated necessarily. So when you get it from that frozen state and you thaw it, you can certainly leave it out at room temperature and warm it to that 70 degrees. And eventually those cultures are going to continue to proliferate. And they even will in your refrigerator. The range for cultures to grow can be very wide. So cultures and even pathogens can grow as low as 40, 45 degrees. They can grow down at those temperatures, but you're going to slow down that fermentation. So when we heat that milk, we exasperate the fermentation, right? We want it to go quickly, and so that's one key difference is you're going to have a lot more lactic acid development. So lactose turns to lactic acid from the bacteria. That's what they metabolize, right? That's going to feel sour on the tongue, but that also tells you that that's a fully fermented milk. So your microbial load, your probiotic load's going to be higher in the kefir, and it's going to be more diversified because now we have yeast cultures in there. And one of the great things about introducing yeast to your dog, not all yeast is bad, right? So we know a lot of people deal with yeast infections and their dogs are trying to control it on the skin. And one way you can do that is beneficial yeast will fight or compete with bad yeast. So Candida albicans is one that we struggle with a lot with dogs. Well, Saccharomyces boulardii and Saccharomyces cerevisiae will compete with Candida and shut that down. So by feeding a true kefir milk, you're going to have a lot more yeast added to that microbial load. And we wanted to do that because we feel that's beneficial. That's a beneficial tool. Now, the setback to that is if your dog was used to drinking the milk more in a fresh state, right, before the lactic acid develops, it's going to taste more like fresh milk to them. And now with the full kefir ferment, they're going to have a sour, that pH is lower, and you're going to have a more sour taste. So what I've done in the past with dogs is added if you're going to introduce them to kefir and they're not used to it, you can do a blend. So you could take like our Tex sauce, which doesn't have the full ferment, it's cultured but not full ferment, and you could put that, or the goat nog, you could mix it with the kefir and subtly keep adding more and more of the tummy butter kefir to get them used to that sour state.
So I'll just add to that, like you covered most of the things that I would have covered anyway. So some other tips on how to get them to try it. Yes, diluting it with any of the other milks at all. Like you are getting a slightly lower intake of those beneficial yeasts, but you could also increase that by doing the dilution of two different things multiple times in a day to get the total intake of the good bacteria up. You can also mix it with something that just has a much stronger flavor, like the fish jiggles. You can mix it in with the food in smaller amounts. Also, if you freeze things, it doesn't have quite as strong of a taste. So freezing it, like thawing it, putting it into an ice cube tray or like a silicone, like the Messy Mutts silicone trays or something like that, and then refreezing it so you're giving it as an ice cube. That can also be good, even in a sense diluted. Several of our herbal blends can be steeped as a tea, and it extracts a bunch of the nutritional benefits out of the herbs. So you can steep a tea, let it cool. You don't want to mix it with the kefir or any of the milks hot, because then you're going to kill those beneficial bacteria that you're trying to give them. But you can go ahead and let it cool down, mix it into the kefir, which will again dilute the flavor a little bit. And then if you want, you can even freeze that blend into little treats, and then you can have like perfectly little dosed cookies that you're giving. So there's a variety of different ways that you can give it if they don't like it straight. I personally tend to struggle a little bit with kefir just by itself if it's done correctly, and usually I will mix it with just another milk. Like we can't say that you can drink our milks, but I mix the goat nog and the kefir together, and then I just drink them like that, so it's not quite as tart for me too. So I know for sure that it works.
I drizzle a little honey. Just drizzle a little bit of honey around the rim of your cup, and then it fills that sour note if it's too sour.
Yeah.
So
I'm
essentially,
gonna try that.
essentially, if your pets are having a hard time trying the new Kefir recipe, just dilute it with any of our other milks or foods. And the benefit of doing kefir is increased microbial proliferation throughout the product, as well as that beneficial yeast that's going to really help balance an out of whack system. Excellent summary. I think we only have time for maybe one or two more. I'm going to ask, we'll do one that's a bit quick and then one that you guys can kind of go off on. In terms of transitioning a pet from a kibble product, like a dried kibble product, to fresh foods in general or solutions specifically, that can be kind of a rocky step forward. So if you guys have any tips for how to make transitioning from dried food to fresh foods a bit easier, that would be helpful for some people out there for sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna let Chelsea do most of this. I think real quick, the easiest thing in my mind is the best transition food, hands down, that I've seen people use is our raw goat milk. So introducing that slowly, but Chelsea's more the expert on getting people transitioned, so I'll let her dive into that.
So there are two primary methods. One is, of course, the traditional method of a slow transition over time. I tend to not really recommend that one as much. It's more taxing physically and emotionally for your pet as well as for you. So if you know for sure that your pet has a very sensitive stomach, then you can do that slow transition. My recommendation with that is that the first step in transition is add milk to the food that you're doing without starting with the raw yet, because in doing that, you are acclimating their digestive system to the good bacteria and to the process of accepting more natural products. So that would be step one. Our regulator product is really, really, really good for helping to prevent or eliminate diarrhea. So if you know that they're sensitive, or if you're like me and you're just really lazy about diarrhea, I am like, I don't even care whether or not you'd get it. I don't want to deal with it. Just load them up with some of the regulator so that both of us get a really good night's sleep. And if at about 3 days I start to take them off of regulator and they have a little loose stool, then I'll just reintroduce it back in, go up to 10 days. If you have to do it more than 10 days, then you should just reach out to us, because there's probably something else that's going on. But my personal preference, and what I've done with about 40 foster dogs, is just a cold turkey transition. There is actually research out there from a man named Mark Roberts showing that if you fast a dog for 24 hours, it significantly alters the gut biome and basically preps them for transition to a fresh food diet. So if you can't emotionally handle fasting your pet for 24 hours, then just give them milk for the day. You can give up to 1 cup per 10 pounds of body weight per day. Because it's only a day, it's not necessary to do that much, but you can go up to that high. Typically, I'm just like, meh. Looks good. So it's really up to you how much you want to give for that day, but they will transition much more easily. Just cold turkey switch if you just do that 1 day fast in the middle. And again, you can always just have the regulator in your house as backup in case it doesn't go as planned. I recommend having that even if your pet does not have digestive issues, because it's inevitably 8 p.m. on a Sunday night that something comes up where they got into something and you don't want to go to the ER. It's just nice to have on hand. Also, just fun side note, I make that into little pills and I take that traveling with me. So anybody that has difficulty with traveling and their stomach working correctly, I'm like, here, pills, regulator, everybody gets it. So it's really nice just to have
pills,
all
you
the time.
mean the homemade regulator pills.
Yeah. Don't leave them without them.
I wouldn't even have thought to recommend regulator for that. So even though it's like, duh, that's what it's for, you know. But
Yeah. Yeah.
Fantastic. The question that I think you guys can kind of go off on a little bit until we run out of time is just some questions about, we're still dealing with questions about grain-free food causing heart conditions. So first of all, just, is that a valid concern that people need to be worried about still? And where can people find good sources of information about that topic that are accurate, and kind of encompassing that entire spectrum of issues that has arisen from that discussion?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that, I've kind of stayed on the surface of this topic, but just because my general philosophy is, again, if you feed a properly balanced fresh food diet, right? We know for a fact that these carnivores have absolutely no need for carbohydrates, including grains, in it, for vitality and for vibrance for these animals. I think there's plenty of evidence that that's already been well established, and I think even Chelsea referred to Mark Roberts. He's got research on this type of what they pick in the wild to eat and choose. Fiber's great, and vegetables can be great for dogs. And I'm not against putting vegetable matter in introducing that in a dog's diet, but I have not seen any valid evidence that says you have to provide a grain-based type starch to these animals in order for heart health. I think that that's a fallacy. I think that that's been something that's been perpetuated in the big ag dog food circles to try to gain some market share back, that has gone to what they call these boutique type foods. And I really think it's unfortunately is a lot of propaganda, and there's just not a lot of evidence to support it. So a species appropriate fresh food diet will support heart health. There's no specific nutrient or micronutrient or element that's delivered in grains that has to be there for heart health. And I know Chelsea's done further dives and deep dives and wrote some articles on this, so I'll let her finish up with that.
So I have a handful of different articles about this where I did a comparison to the current data multiple different times that was released by the FDA, and kind of an assessment of the hundreds of pages of things that they put out. So all of them have different information. We can go ahead and post those, I believe, on the Heroes, or not the Heroes, we'll post them on the Solutions blog page. So if you want to do a deep dive, then you can go that route. I think the most important abbreviated points are really, one, the whole grain-free thing actually came out after Petco decided to eliminate a whole bunch of grain-containing products from their shelves. So they decided to go with some higher standards. And in response to that, we know for a fact that some of the bigger companies like Mars and Purina went ahead and started jumping on this wagon of, hey, we can use this thing that was said by this doctor about grains as a way to regain market share. So they really, really heavily focused on, I think, largely getting their shelf space back, that where they were losing tons of money because of this change. There is currently a lawsuit against the vets and companies that started this rumor that I believe is for $2.5 billion. So just to show how significant they are looking to be punished for having started this. We know for a fact that the most important thing for tissue repair, including the heart, so muscles and heart, the heart is a muscle, is amino acids. And if you look at the amino acid content of meat versus the amino acid content of grain, obviously meat is going to be significantly better for the heart and for tissue repair. Taurine is commonly brought up as being a really important thing to supplement. There's not taurine in grains, so you're not resolving anything there. And I also think that it's really important to point out the fact that this condition, like the specific condition about heart disease that's being focused on, is DCM, so dilated cardiomyopathy. This condition is primarily genetic and it's breed specific. There has been an increase in the cases of DCM in golden retrievers, but there's also been an increase in incidence of a variety of other diseases in golden retrievers as well, and other breeds. So to say, hey, every dog is now at risk for DCM as a result of eating these grain-free diets, when there's really not a significant increase except in one breed, and like you can't say that that applies to food if it's just the one breed that that's occurring in. And it also occurs in less than 0.1% of the canine population. So heart disease in general is actually not much higher than that. But another variable to compare that to is cancer. We know that 50 to 75% of dogs right now are dying of cancer. And we also have lots of scientific evidence that proves that if you feed a high sugar, high carbohydrate diet as the primary diet, especially if it's high heat processed, it increases the risk of cancer. So in a sense, it's like, don't look at that man behind the curtain, which is the cancer that's being caused by all of these grain-containing foods, but instead let's focus on this heart disease that your dog, unless they're a specific breed, they're almost guaranteed to not end up with heart disease at all. And if they are a specific breed, grains are not going to prevent them from getting heart disease. You might be able to offset it with proteins, with certain herbs, maybe with medication, but the chances that they're going to get heart disease are pretty high because it's a genetic issue. The last point that I want to make about it is, let's really talk about the reality of grains. So in the pet food industry, there are, I can think of two companies that I know, well, three companies that I know that use actual grains in their products. And every other pet food company that I know of out there is actually primarily using biodiesel byproducts. They are legally registered as chemicals. It is a grain that went into the biodiesel industry and was chemically extracted with 16 different chemicals, many of which are so toxic that you can't release them into the environment. So they're using those chemicals to extract ethanol. Because the ethanol is from the sugars that are in there, liquid gold, as they call it, what is remaining is a high protein trash. It, again, is legally registered by the EPA as a chemical. It is a trash. It happens to be high protein. So that makes it fairly profitable and easier to market to vets, where the vets are not trying to give that information, but they're told, hey, we have this really high protein corn, or, you know, pick the thing that's in this product, and that makes it really healthy. So the focus on the marketing is, hey, this is high protein. Again, let's not look at the man behind the curtain. We're not going to consider the fact that this stuff has sulfur dioxide and anhydrous ammonia and liquid urea and 3 different antibiotics that it's going to make your dog antibiotic resistant because they ate it all the time. Like, this is the grain that is going into the majority of products. So if we're really going to have a talk about whether or not grains are healthy, then we really should be having a talk about grains versus these grain alternatives that are primarily used in pet foods. So I think that those are like the quickest talking points. And then again, for deep dives, it's better just to go to the articles.
Yeah, and we'll have those put up on our website at some point, hopefully.
And just to add to that real quick, as an example of what Chelsea's saying, that these spent grains that have already been through a fermentation process for biodiesel, you know, still when you put them in a laboratory will show high protein. Well, if we flash back to 2007, what was in dog food that was showing up high in a laboratory on protein, melamine, right?
Mm.
So just because your laboratory analysis shows that something's there, and that's what they're leaning on. So just don't be blinded by that, and that's where you need to really look into, like she said, the man behind the, don't look at the man behind the curtain on what they're trying to sell you, and that's just unfortunate, and that's where being a educated consumer is so important, uh, more important than ever has been in history, to know what you're dealing with, because of the propaganda that's out there, and the marketing, the dilution of the marketing to make you look that one way versus another. So appreciate everyone that's tuning into this today.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to add a really quick thing to that on the importance of being an educated consumer, especially right now. A lot of the big companies are losing market share to people trying to feed more natural. And at the last 2 industry trade shows that I've been to, I've counted 72 new kibble companies. And several of them have booths that are so big. They're $50,000-$100,000 booths, which no small new company can afford. So I think what's happening is that some of these really big companies are like, hey, don't buy our food, buy that food over there. And it's the same company doing the same thing in a different packaging, labeled a different way, that isn't directly affiliated with that reputation. So seriously, now more than ever, it is so important to be an educated consumer, and you do largely have to do it yourself, which means looking for informational podcasts that are not funded by the big companies.
Yeah, and to that point, we really appreciate you guys taking time to watch Chelsea and Roxanne kind of just talk about their experiences in the industry and their scientific knowledge regarding these topics. Taking that extra time and that extra step to make sure that you guys are that educated consumer and are capable of making the best choice possible for your pets.